Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Michael Barnett, who is Professor of Management and Global Business at Rutgers Business School and Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. Mike currently serves as an International Research Fellow of the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation, Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Social Innovations Group at eGate Business School in Mexico, Affiliate Visiting Scholar at the Price College of Business at the University of Oklahoma, and Fellow of the Institute of Ethical Leadership at Rutgers University. Welcome, Mike.
Oh, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
I want to start with one of your recent papers entitled The Rise and Stall of Stakeholder Influence, How the Digital Age Limits Social Control, in which you ask, have stakeholders increased their influence over firm behavior in the digital age? Before we get into it, Mike, I want to get a definition of stakeholder. When I think about stakeholders in general, I think about shareholders, managers of the firm, employees, buyers and suppliers to the firm, maybe the immediate community the firm is located, and society more broadly. Is that a complete set, or am I missing somebody?
Well, it's a pretty amorphous concept that has been, has been accused of being kind of all things to all people and therefore meaningless in some settings. But yeah, I think your list is pretty accurate. We have some breakdown a variety of different ways between primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders is one of the distinctions that we make. So, but yeah, it's those who can affect or are affected by the firm's behaviors is the general definition.
Okay.
And over time, it's become mostly focused on those who can affect the firm.
Okay. And so what's the difference? How do you differentiate between primary and secondary stakeholders?
Generally, it's if they have a transactional relationship with the firm.
The primary ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if they have resources that the firm wants access to, and therefore they can basically have direct power over the firm by their willingness to provide those resources and end on favorable terms.
Okay. And so in the paper, you say, I mean, this is sort of what you reached in terms of a conclusion. You say, we draw from cognitive theory to argue that although social media has made it easier for stakeholders to broadcast their demands, the methods used to cope with the drastic change in quantities and qualities of information in the digital age have limited stakeholder influence in the aggregate. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, there was this great hope. I don't know if you can cast your mind back all the way to the turn of the millennium, but when the digital age was coming along, there was just this grand notion that now with instant access to companies, even secondary stakeholders, anybody can have a significant influence over firm behavior. And so there was going to be this sort of democratization of control of firms.
Yeah.
But that hasn't really come to be realized. I mean, the problem is that it basically has given everybody a microphone or a megaphone, really. Everybody can shout anything that they want, but now everybody has a megaphone. And so it's just a bunch of noise. And actually, firms can play that to their advantage. And they actually, that's the stall notion of stakeholder influence. They still maintain the discretion to behave as they want. They can sort of ride out the storm and even play some games by pretending to be some of these stakeholders themselves through astroturfing and other ways of kind of disguising their behaviors in the social media sphere. So in the end, I mean, we don't now have more control over firm behaviors, even though from time to time something happens that gives any given individual some undue influence. Like they can send a tweet that inadvertently ends up catching the media storm that particular day and does have an influence, but in the aggregate, any individual is no more likely to change corporate behavior than they did before, and corporations still pretty much have the run of the house themselves.
Yeah, so when I think about this, the secondary stakeholders, for example, so I think about incentives, Mike, and so that the general notion of the firm is that the managers of the firm take decisions and actions to maximize shareholder value. And that notion is not necessarily true, as many of us know. And so I think about incentives both for the firm to act as well as sort of the distributed, let's call it secondary stakeholders to act. Could you talk a bit about incentives on both sides of this puzzle?
Well, excuse me again. We're trying to really get this alignment between business and society. That's kind of the holy grail of the invisible hand guiding firm behaviors when they benefit themselves to also benefit society.
Yeah.
And the idea is that this alignment doesn't quite fit between secondary stakeholders in the interest of the firm, but it can fit with primary stakeholders. So we developed this business case really over time that's trying to make the connection between the actions of the firms and secondary stakeholders, even though it's really only going to benefit the primary stakeholders. So firms will do things that benefit the primary stakeholders while not necessarily doing those things that benefit secondary stakeholders.
Right. So if they were to have some sort of a objective function, it doesn't necessarily include the secondary stakeholders. And the notion there is the secondary stakeholders may have some issue with the firm, or they have some guidance for the firm, and so they can assemble, and given the social media, the power of social media, ask the firm to do something. Now, at that juncture, the firm's managers have to sort of look at that request and look at what they're trying to maximize, right?
Right. Yeah, and so often it's not so easy to make the business case for some of these societal issues, and so they go by the wayside.
Yeah.
Unless there's a time of just excess resources, or they're under attack, or it's the kind of the pet project of a particularly powerful primary stakeholder. So if the primary stakeholders care about this, then the firms may take it on. But just out of general kindness, that's often not a great long-term driver of corporate behavior.
Right. And you talk about again, if I think about incentives, there is an information overload in the internet, as we all are very familiar with.
All right.
And so there are two competing things going on. The secondary stakeholders now, presumably, they have a stage to interact with the firm. But on the other hand, there is so much information that is coming to them, it becomes difficult for them to assemble, to get on that stage, to do something.
Right. Yeah. So it's difficult for secondary stakeholders to break through. I mean, there are so many of them coming at the firm from very different directions that firms basically don't have to listen to any of those because they can ride out that storm, and there'll be a different sort of social media shout at them in a different direction shortly after that. So None of this really comes together. Everybody can individually shout, but there's not a whole lot of unified direction.
Right. And the firm can easily, like you say, it can easily ignore it, because
Typically.
it tends to be noise. But you could also come at it from another direction, that the firms actually using this to influence consumers in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you had cited, a case of Walmart co-opting bloggers.
Right.
Uh, could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's the astroturfing notion, the idea that they pretend to be a sort of grassroots movement and try to gain the legitimacy associated with that. So it's not, you can't really tell if you're talking to a bot, if you're talking to a real person, if you're talking to somebody with an interest that is supported by a company. Social media makes this even easier to do, and so firms just get more sophisticated in it. They can be taken aback by any individual person who kind of comes out of the blue, but they can also pretend to be those people and kind of counter it.
Yeah.
So the degree to which they can play that game, or what we describe in that process model in the paper as sense-giving activities, they can, also shape the conversation, not simply react to it.
Right. And that becomes increasingly relevant for the era of fake news in some ways.
Yeah.
It's not just corporations, but also we are seeing it in the political arenas, right?
Yeah. So all of this is very top of mind as we, watch the Republican National Convention and so forth. The stories can be shaped in very interesting ways, and the audience, the part of the paper too is about the bubbles and the idea that it's very hard to get information that invalidates any particular view to any particular stakeholder. And so the likelihood that individuals are going to attack firms decreases as well, because they're not getting any conflicting information.
Right.
All the information is kind of, everybody can have their own personalized channel that only tells them what they already want to hear. And then they can also discount it as fake news if it might be accidentally fall into their space and it discounts what they've said.
Yeah. So it is, in some sense, it's sort of scary in the sense that um, because we don't really have any control over the message, so to speak. It's possible in some arenas, fake news has more power than real news, right?
Definitely. I mean, it reinforces what you already think if it's used effectively, and so and then sort of makes you invulnerable to actual facts. So in the end, even if you're earnest and you're not biased in any particular way, you don't know what to pay attention to, what to believe, and so everything becomes questionable, and it's really hard to distinguish reality.
Yeah, and so this you might be able to predict this from a theoretical perspective, that you get polarization not only as in the secondary stakeholder community for a firm, but also in the political arenas. Because you tend to believe, or you tend to listen to what you believe, and then you only listen to that. So it's a reinforcing effect.
Right. And so when we think about the digital age and, the idea that somehow we have access to all this information, but we pay attention to a narrower and narrower and more specialized slice. And so it's perverse in that we actually get less informed. So we have access to more food, but we eat more and more junk food. We get unhealthier as a result. And it has a perverse outcome, which is, really the point we were trying to make in that paper, is that with all of this, we actually don't have more control. It's stalled out, and we suspect it actually has declined.
Yeah. And when you reviewed the literature, you ask, why do organizations act as they do? And you say, and maybe this is from Freeman paper in 1984, stakeholder theory bridges these perspectives by arguing that because they can affect firm performance, stakeholders influence firm behavior, but firms make strategic decisions about how to respond to stakeholder demands.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea has gotten more and more sort of obscure, in the sense that if there was any accountability in the past for the firms to respond to some stakeholder objection, it has become less so now, right? Because of all the noise.
Possibly.
Yeah.
These do tire out pretty quickly. The Twitter storms have less than 24-hour cycles.
Yeah.
And so you can generally wait them out. But, the other interesting angle of that is that people feel like they've done something if all they do is just like or forward or, retweet something. And so that we call that slacktivism. And,
Yeah.
and it's very easy to write out. And so people can basically vent their spleen on social media, and companies can, ignore it for a day, and then it goes on. We have very short memories, and companies that even get heavily pilloried and maybe lose significant stock value one day bounce back the next. And so companies figure out that if they just ignore it or they gently apologize but don't change their behavior, folks it may look bad for a day, but they'll go past it in the next.
And again, in the review of literature, again, you find that it's an empirical study by Easley and Lennox in 2006 that legitimate and urgent requests by secondary stakeholders are more likely to receive positive responses from firms. It seems obvious, but it has a lot of implications as to how secondary stakeholders should think about what they want to do, right? It's I think a lot of the responses maybe from the airwaves is driven by emotions, and emotions are self-reinforcing and gets amplified in the social channels, and so by the time it gets to the firm, it may not be a legitimate issue, and it takes a long time to get there.
Oh, sure. And firms that aren't really taking the long view and just kind of are knee-jerk responding can get swayed by that emotion and do some quick action that they often have to reverse as another group who has the opposite view comes in and attacks them.
Right.
We've seen it many, many times. An example that comes to mind is, I think, support for gay rights at Walt Disney World or Microsoft. So at one point, they supported it, and then the next day they pulled their support because they were pushed back by the right, and you just ended up looking very bad. The companies need to do things that are more consonant with their identity and stick with those and defend them where necessary, as opposed to being just kind of buffeted around as they get a bad tweet here and there.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a question of sort of the power struggle, right? Typologies of stakeholder influence strategies have been developed based on essentially two dimensions: firm power and stakeholder power.
Right.
And so I don't know what your perspective is, Mike. So stakeholders are distributed. Isn't the firm in a better position to sort of look at the variety of responses they're getting to optimize it the way that it wants to do, whereas the stakeholders don't really have sufficient, I shouldn't say competence, but information and transparency to do that in a systematic way, or not?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's my ultimate argument is that, we've been trying to come up with this kind of market solutions to corporate governance for decades, and we've successfully sold it in the academic literature, and of course businesses buy into it because it keeps government off their back. But decentralizing control of corporations to individuals means that you're putting it into the hands of people who really don't have access to all the information or even the ability to distinguish what should be done, and they all disagree as well. And so that leaves companies with a lot of discretion to play. I mean, classic corporate governance outside of the digital age talks about, basically shareholder concentration. And if you have a few large shareholders, you're much more closely governed than if you have a very distributed, everybody owns a couple of shares. You can basically do whatever you want as a result. And that's what this has produced, an environment where there is no centralized control because government has backed off under the notion that the reputation of the firm will hold sway, and they'll obviously only do good things because they don't want to harm their reputation. But that reputational mechanism is in the hands of all these people who really don't know what's going on and can easily be played by a skillful company.
Right. Yeah. So you say also in the paper, Mike, where there is high interdependence, because the firm is centrally located in a dense stakeholder network. The firm will negotiate with those stakeholders who deal directly with the firm by attaching strings to the resources, the use of resources those stakeholders could control. So this is more probably more relevant for primary stakeholders, right?
Well, that's again, the logic is that firms will be concerned with societal issues to the degree, which is the realm of some of these secondary stakeholders, to the degree that their primary stakeholders are.
Yeah.
And so, if they're not, then they really don't have the discretion, the freedom to do it, because then they would be harmed by their powerful primary stakeholders.
Right. Right. Yeah, and you're looking at there's a lot of literature around this. It's a topic that is researched quite a bit, but you note that there are certain assumptions made in previous work that may not be true. For example, you say rarely are the bounded rationality of the actors and limitations to cognitive capacity taken into account in stakeholder influence literature.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to the idea that, especially secondary stakeholders is a collection of individuals who may be motivated by something, but may not have the capacity to really analyze and rationally think about it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. A lot of my work is trying to create more of a process for stakeholder influence over firms and firms' influences over stakeholders. Getting beyond kind of the point estimate is the way I describe a lot of the work in the literature. Is they say, given this situation, how will a stakeholder respond? Will they attack the firm? Will they ignore it? But that presumes that the stakeholder has even seen it.
Yeah.
But we're all dealing, we are the stakeholders, and I really don't have any idea what's going on at ExxonMobil right now, or any other companies. And so we're expected to somehow keep track of all this. And then as a company does something bad, somehow that's supposed to filter into our consciousness and lead to that decision point. But I say step back if you up to the top of that particular funnel and see whether or not you even notice it, and then how you process it before you even come to that decision point. Yeah. And you'll see that most of it gets filtered out before you even have the chance to make that decision.
Yeah. So you have a framework here you call stakeholder influence in the digital age, where you have information disclosures that gets filtered into shareholder decisions to act, that gets framed into changes in firm behaviors. And we talked about a little bit of this already. There is, you call it sense making and sense giving,
right?
From disclosures into the decisions. You want to describe that a bit?
Well, I mean, that's all different parts of the process. And sense making and sense giving are kind of standard terms in the literature. We just applied it to this particular setting. But, the idea is that as an event happens, it has to actually be processed. You have to decide whether it's a good act or a bad act. I mean, different people are going to disagree about it, or relative to a given firm. If it has a good history, then the new events might be interpreted in a more favorable light than if that firm has had a bad history, for example. And so all of that stuff gets wrapped up into the sense-making process of the individual stakeholder as to how they make sense of any given action that they might have noticed. Yeah. And the sense-giving is on the firm side of things, and maybe other stakeholders where there are others who are trying to shape that sense-making process. And so they're providing new information, maybe responding to the crisis, maybe on social media to try and help you to think better of the firm and the action that it took. And so those are kind of, doing battle. All of this, as you are pointing out, is described in sort of a battle framework, but it is a battle for making sense of this and deciding whether or not it's actually going to have any influence on the firm and its behaviors over time.
Right. And then the next step, once the stakeholder decisions to act, you have sort of you call slacktivism and synchronicity.
Right.
So slacktivism is basically stakeholders taking sort of a lazy approach to it.
Right. So if a firm does something bad, we're seeing this now, you could literally go burn the firm down, right? Or you could do many things short of that, which is not buy from them. You could choose to basically do nothing. Or what the social media age has really made happen a lot is you can just post something. You can like it, you can forward it, share it, and so forth. And that may be enough for you to feel like you've done something. And so you don't have to take that next step. You don't actually have to change your behavior, which might then change the firm's behavior. You don't have to stop buying from that gas station or that store.
Right, right. And, you also look at, so synchronicity, from a firm perspective, but also from a governmental perspective, where there's a case where Chinese regime follows two strategies. The first is passive, wherein the social media impersonators are told not to engage on controversial issues. And the second is active, wherein they are told to stop discussions with the potential for collective action through active distraction and active censorship. Now, this is noted in China, but I would imagine this is happening all around the world today.
Yeah, I don't have any insights, and I'm hoping that most firms aren't quite that conniving, but certainly there are very active social media and crisis response teams that do go into social media and make a concerted effort, generally disguised, to shape the conversation and disrupt. Because if there still is a coordination issue, you don't actually have to bring everybody into the same space physically now. You can do it more easily and costlessly, basically, via social media. But everybody is distracted, and anybody can be in charge of that thing because there is no price to it. And so it's very hard to know how to, and so it still becomes very hard to synchronize activities where the real power lies. If everybody is aligned and to the tip of a spear, then you're very powerful. But if everybody is running in different directions, like the proverbial herd of cats, then nothing happens. And so we just pointed out basically that just because it's free and costless to do doesn't mean that we can effectively synchronize all these behaviors. In fact, with everybody having their own kind of very customized view of what the company should do, it's actually very easy for everybody to just be parties of one and attack it.
Right. Yeah. So I want to jump into another paper which is sort of related, but in a different topic, and it's entitled "Beyond Good Intentions: Designing Corporate Social Responsibility (CSR) Initiatives for Greater Social Impact." Where you ask, are corporate social responsibility initiatives providing a societal good that they promise? And again, you looked at some of the literature, some of the research that has been done in this area.
We looked at all of it.
You looked at all of it. Yeah. You want to talk a bit about that?
Oh, sure. So this is, I'm glad I'd forgotten which papers we were going to discuss. And so I'm glad that we're discussing the two papers that were both with the same author team. Did these both in conjunction with Irene Henriquez at York University in Toronto and Brian Husted, who's at the IGADE Business School in Monterrey, Mexico. And in this one, it's a meta study. Well, not actually a meta study. It's a review study.
Yeah.
Part of the this year's special review issue for Journal of Management. And we looked at literally all of the CSR performance studies out there, and it's a massive literature, particularly since 2010. But we found, I think, some 6,200 plus studies that looked at the performance outcome. And what we were curious about is whether or not, the degree to which the literature has shown that all of these CSR activities, or any of these CSR activities, actually have social impact. Because there are all these programs, companies are putting literally billions of dollars, a lot of it in marketing, but a lot of it substantively as well, into efforts to have significant impact on very big problems. If you look at some of the materials of some of the major corporations, I mean, they are making grand claims about transforming society in very meaningful, important ways. So we thought, well, let's look at the studies, and because we don't have direct access to all of these projects, let's look at the studies and see if we find that impact. And we did not. I don't want to spoil the surprise. Literally zero.
Yeah. So I found it very interesting, Mike. So you sort of looked at it longitudinally as well, right?
Since what do we go back to 1970 or so? Yeah, we tried to look at all of it, but it wasn't really substantive until the turn of the millennium, and then particularly in the most recent decade was 5,000 plus of the 6,000 plus.
Yeah, so one of the things that I picked up is you say annual spending by Fortune 500 firms on corporate philanthropy exceeds 15 billion in dollar amounts. In a regime where we have one company worth $2 trillion. I don't know if that is that significant. What do you
Well,
think?
that's a good point, relative,
Yeah.
but it's still a lot of money that could make a big difference. I think I could probably have a hell of a party with just a fraction of that money.
That's for sure. So you say in the paper that scholars have shown that CSR can provide relational, reputation, and financial benefits to the firm undertaking it. And so let me ask you sort of a loaded question. Is CSR sort of a marketing gimmick of Fortune 500 firms, or is something more to it?
Well, I mean, that's the battle. It is mostly a marketing gimmick because it's intended to, kind of improve the image of the firm in the eyes of those primary stakeholders that it's very vital that they maintain solid support with. But it's really up to those primary stakeholders whether or not it's substantive. If, as we've already described, maybe almost certainly we can't do it, but we are at least trying to pretend that all of us as primary stakeholders can we can call bullshit on firms, and we can actually tell whether or not they're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And if we could, and if we cared enough to dig into it, then we could force firms to be substantive, and they wouldn't get those PR benefits. In fact, it would backfire if they weren't doing it substantively. I mean, the one saving grace is that if they are just doing it for PR and it's not really being done substantively, then in effect, they're increasing their risk profile, because if they are found out,
Yeah.
then that bubble will burst. But then again, as we just discussed, it's probably a very short-lived bout of trouble, and people will forget about it.
Yeah, and I think you talk about this in the paper, since we don't really have very clear measurements of outcome, societal benefits outcome. It's very difficult, quote unquote, to find out, because you can always say, always point to something that
Right.
where that initiatives has resulted in. And so, my experience with Fortune 500 companies, both as a consultant and from within, there are a lot of initiatives like that. There is a portfolio of initiatives a large company pursues in this area, but there is very little accountability, for these types of initiatives. Typically, they're handled by people who are not in a line function, but typically on a staff type function. And so there is much lower level of transparency and accountability. And so what comes out of that could be sort of a random outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, most of us, most of the time, are happy to just be associated with a company that says it's doing nice things. We don't really want to know. We don't want to get too much into the weeds on that. And so, it's very easy for a company to get away with, a nice glossy show, but not necessarily any substance behind it. And they're not really going to fight that, because they don't want to be that accountable either. It's hard to do it effectively, and it might require more resources, and they might not be doing it right in the first place. And so there's no need, if your stakeholders don't care, or they're satisfied with something short of that, then of course you're going to stick with something short of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I found this, you took all the literature out there on this topic, and you did a cluster analysis, but also showing the interconnectivity between them.
Right.
And you did that for the entire data set, and then you looked at for specific chunks of time, right?
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, so there appears to be three different major clusters, and then those things have kind of moved around over time, right?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me. I
Yeah.
apologize for that. I should have been wise enough to pull that up on the computer. But Yeah, so this is, we did a visual mapping.
Yeah.
Irene Henriquez, the second co-author, she has kind of, this is her baby using this particular technique, and it shows some very neat things when you have a data set that's large, that's so large that you couldn't really get a hold of a true understanding of it without kind of doing it in a pictorial format. And so you get this cloud of different clusters, and they're related in different ways, and we show how they evolved over time. But because so much of it has been chunked into the last decade, we couldn't show a great deal of transformation in a very fine way. But overall, we did show this kind of transition to further down in what we describe as a logic model, toward trying to get past hand waving and toward at least showing some outcomes, but not whether or not the program itself was responsible for those outcomes. It's a bit like we're dealing with these COVID vaccine trials, right? So
Yeah.
we have some things that have shown some outcomes, but we haven't done the correct tests of them that show whether or not relative to a placebo they have any effect. So it's like that with the best CSR programs are at least dealing with the idea that they need to have some sort of outcome measure, and that's as far as we've really gotten in the literature. But we still haven't gotten to true impact because we're not properly designing these things to allow for that sort of outcome.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that jumped out, I don't know if this is relevant, Mike. When we look at the three cluster analysis over time, the big bubble in the middle was labeled responsibility. That seems to shrink over time, and so the last analysis post 2010s, there is no bubble that's labeled responsibility anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What is the implication of that?
I don't know offhand.
Yeah. Okay.
I've forgotten about that particular aspect of it, but the terminology changes over time.
Yeah.
We've moved from corporate social responsibility to maybe a focus on sustainability or innovation and impact, and so some of that is just a change in the scholarly terminology. We do have this great habit of trying to make our particular term be the grand one that's used across all studies, and sometimes that works.
Okay. And you have a logic model, as you mentioned, a corporate social responsibility logic model. And, you have some antecedents, you have corporate social activities, you have results, outcomes, and ultimately impacts. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty, again, is, really kind of going through this entire model and getting to real impacts of this, CSR initiatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, so as you look forward in this arena, how do you think companies should think about this? I mean, if they're really serious about these initiatives, and mm-hmm. they're really serious about actually delivering a societal good that is tangible, that's measurable, that's demonstrable, mm-hmm. What do you think are the characteristics of these initiatives that will have a higher chance of doing that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they're all going to be very idiosyncratic relative to, they've got to be focused on the specific setting. And so I don't think there's a generalizable model for any given program, but we can start to develop design rules. I mean, the idea is that we put forward in that paper is that you should be pushing companies to use a design approach, design sciences, to design studies and treat them like experiments, like medical studies in a way, and control for a variety of factors and experiment using a variety of different methods and see which ones work in your particular setting.
Yeah.
And then, learn that, benchmark that to other studies. And overall, we could then get kind of a cumulative body of knowledge of what works for a particular type of program in a particular type of setting in a particular point in time in a particular country and so forth. So we would need to, we've got the energy, we've got the studies there. I mean, if people have done in the last decade more than 5,000 published studies, which means they've probably actually done 10 or 12,000 or more, then we have enough, push behind this to do it effectively through all those different iterations that it would actually take. But overall, we're talking about as a design approach where we actually use a very sophisticated, controlled experimental method to see what works and what doesn't work, and then fine tune that in that exact same way over time to figure out the best approaches to these things. So, if you want to end hunger in your community, there probably is a best way to do it. It's not just random, whoever happens to show up in the corporate social responsibility office at your company at that point in time and said, I got a few free hours. There's a very systematic way to do it. And companies have, this is why we even care about corporate social responsibility, is because corporations have this powerful set of tools and resources and processes that allow them to make a significant, scalable difference, impact in on whatever they choose to do. So we're just saying if they choose to do corporate social responsibility, let's do it right. Actually use all those same tools to make an impact and not just do enough to get credit for it.
Right. Yeah. It also seemed to me, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, this is very amenable to sort of economic valuation, right? So we cannot do a net present value here, but, this will be a bundle of uncertainties, bundle of options, interrelated things. So you could apply options pricing methodologies. I'm just thinking about standardization, right? So especially from a micro perspective, from a inside the company perspective, if I'm going to run, a portfolio of CSR initiatives and they're going to be interrelated, I will have an obligation to shareholders to demonstrate an economic value that I'm delivering to society, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it's very amenable to those types of analysis.
Well, and in fact, I've suggested we're not going to talk about other papers, but in some other work, I have compared corporate social responsibility to real options approach, and so has one of my co-authors there, Brian Husted, in some of his work. But I've also been very critical of a real options perspective because effectively you can put any numbers you want in there, and it becomes still the same thing as executive judgment. I mean, you can you can decide.
The gut feel overrides everything.
It does, or at least you can then put in numbers that justify it based on that gut feel.
Yeah. Now the issue there is getting managers in a firm who are very, very used to deterministic view of cash flows to really start thinking about uncertainties and how to sort of maximize that limited resource that the company has put forward. And if you find that Initiative 5 is, sort of, 1% of Initiative 7, you do have to understand that, because the company may put in the same level of attention and resources to both initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately there are only so many people, so much time and energy, so much attention, so much money, and so you should use that as effectively as possible to help society. There should be some interest in doing that, and again, it's a question of whether or not those in society will demand it. And if we ignore it, then it's fine just to use all that money for some nice and glossy efforts.
Yeah, and I think corporations now have a hierarchy of problems they could focus on, and society has sort of put a prioritization of those activities, right? So you have global warming that most people tend to think is a major problem. There is other things underneath that. So one question, in conclusion, Mike, if you were to sort of go inside a company and say, I'm really serious about this. I want to have a portfolio of CSR initiatives, and I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to demonstrate value. What is the process that you would put in, and who are the type of people that you will engage to accomplish that?
Right. I think this has to be something that is coming from the top and is ingrained in the company. If it's just a set aside and something that you do to kind of keep the stakeholders or keep the bad publicity outside of the company. If you're just buffering the company from reality by buying it off, in effect, then it's never going to be effective. And you don't really care if it's effective because, again, it's just there as a kind of a blunt force tool protecting the company. you have to integrate it. It has to be an authentic thing. It has to be part of the company. And then these ideas will kind of spring forth better ideas, because they're not, going back to that notion that we're not just looking at the decision point of, here you're presented with a great idea, will you do it or not? Are you even going to get to that point of having that great idea? Where do those come from? Well, that come from sort of living in that environment and having it be a central part of your company. So you're never going to know whether or not you're going to get access to the right opportunities if it's, again, just something that you really don't want to think about. It's not core part of your business. You're just trying to do whatever it takes to not have to mess with it.
Yeah.
Again, it's just something we describe. I'm also academic director. I think you might mention at the start, academic director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, and that's the logic we're trying to push. Is this is about integrating things. This is about integrating the philanthropic efforts with the social responsibility efforts, with the advocacy efforts, and trying to do all of this to create shared value across the company. And so you've got to live it, breathe it, have it be a central part of what you do, and start putting society at the forefront and think, what are the social problems that are out there that this company can profitably serve, and not the reverse, not basically how can we make money and maybe do a little less harm.
Yeah. It's I haven't thought a lot about this, Mike, but I think what you're saying is a very important thing, and that is, if I were to sort of look at the companies that I know and I put them into two buckets, and I ask who is going to be more effective in doing CSR initiatives, the attribute that I would really use is culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's the operating system the company is based on. And that culture will tell you if the company can actually effectively conduct a CSR initiative. Because it's not, it's not what you write in the annual reports. It's not what you put out, in terms of what you're doing. But really, you can look inside the firm and see it is culturally aligned with the firm.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is classic organizational behavior kind of things of internal motivation, psychology, internal motivation versus external motivation. And if it's all external motivation, then, you have to keep getting pushed again and again and again to keep with it. But if it comes from inside, if it's authentic, part of the culture of the organization, then it has a life of its own.
Right. Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much, Mike, for spending time with me. And good luck with this research. It's very important.
Well, thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.